Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We've got a lot to cover over the next couple of hours, 4 different guests, and we're going to be getting into all sorts of issues ranging from Israel to what is happening in Congress, one even dealing with the issue of sexuality, one on immigration. So we just got a lot to cover. We only have a few minutes today with a guest that we have on a regular basis, and that is Representative Van Taylor, represents the 3rd Congressional District in the state of Texas. And we have lots of great information about him. And in case you find yourself wanting to know a little bit more about a couple of the pieces of legislation that he's introduced, of course, you can go to vantaylor.house.gov. Congressman Taylor, always good to have you on the program with us.
It'll be great to be back.
Let's, if we can, talk about a couple of your bills. That's one thing I thought would be good. I've always appreciated the fact that you've reached across the aisle and been willing to do things that relate to what we might call any kind of bipartisanship. And one of those where you've worked with Joaquin Castro to actually address the issue of hungry students. Tell us more about that.
Sure. So, in 2017 in Texas, passed on basically unanimous basis a piece of legislation that allowed local school districts to have a food pantry at the school using food that had not been used during the school lunch program. And obviously, we have a lot of children in Texas and around the country that go hungry, and so that's something that certainly as an American, it's upsetting to hear that. And so a way to deal with that is to allow, to stipulate in federal statute that it's okay to use monies that are used to purchase food products for children for the school lunch program, that if the school wants to set up a food pantry, that they can do that. So it's a permissible bill. It allows the school district to make that choice. And certainly we're hoping that more school districts choose to help feed hungry children.
Well, again, it's called the Feeding Hungry Students in School Act. And again, just high points for the fact that you found an individual that is a Democrat that wanted to co-sponsor that with you as well. Another one, Caucus on Innovation and Entrepreneurship. Now, as an individual that has been an entrepreneur and certainly has an MBA degree, you understand the importance of that, but sometimes members of Congress are lawyers and not thinking about things like entrepreneurship and innovation, and this is an attempt to try to stimulate that, isn't it?
Sure, yeah, and so I'm working with Joe Negussi, who is a new Democrat congressman from Colorado, and we're getting the Innovation Caucus back up and going, and so we're trying to encourage innovation and entrepreneurship, and we're looking for legislation and also things that make sense to try to help, grow business and grow the economy. And all those, obviously we're in incredible economic times. You're seeing unemployment at some of the lowest numbers it's ever been. You're watching, everywhere I go around the district, I talk to people who say, I'm having problems hiring the talent that I need. That's because you have literally 1 million more jobs than you have unemployed people in our country today. And I think that's a direct reflection of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Not only did that provide tax cuts for the vast majority of Americans, I think something like 80 or 90%, depending on how you count it, but also it incentivized businesses to bring almost $1 trillion of capital from overseas, and it incentivizes them to spend that money and to invest in their own efforts, because instead of putting on a depreciation schedule, they can expense it immediately. So you're watching literally hundreds of billions of new dollars being invested in our economy around the country, and that's creating tremendous job growth. And that job growth, in turn, is creating wage growth. And so you're seeing some of the most impressive wage growth numbers that we've seen in this country literally in over a decade. And I will say that economists are predicting that this is going to continue through next year, that they're saying very strong continued growth. So the Tax Cuts and Job Act, in addition to putting money in people's pockets directly by tax cuts, it's also very importantly brought capital back to the United States, being invested in businesses, which then in turn is really generating even stronger income appreciation for every American because they're watching their wages go up.
Well, and one other beneficiary of that are the states, it said, because I'm going to be talking about this after you go off the air, but in the state of California, a $21 billion surplus, more than they anticipated in January, same thing in Illinois. But again, the sad reality is, and I'm even noticing this in the state of Texas, record revenue, according to the Pew Charitable Trust, 41 states have hit record tax revenues. But I don't think that's going to go in the pockets of the various citizens of those states. So you and I have talked about that before, and it's just a sad reality of the fact that we are generating too much surplus, but it doesn't end up in the hands of the taxpayers who actually generated it in the first place.
Yeah, no, and certainly, as you know, I'm a strong believer in being a fiscal champion and fighting for less government, and that's something that motivates me to be in office in the first place. In my time in the state legislature, I was recognized by Texans for Fiscal Responsibility, which is the premier fiscal advocacy group in the state of Texas, as a taxpayer champion 4 out of the 4 sessions I served. And interestingly enough, I was the only member of the legislature to be able to say that. So, and I continue to do that here in Washington, and consistently fighting for lower taxes and less government. Because let's face it, government is too big today. In 1900, 8% of U.S. GDP went to government. Today, it's 42%,
yes,
and climbing. And you see a lot of proposals coming out from Democrats here in Washington that are talking about, for instance, their socialized health care bill, Medicaid for All, which basically eliminates all private health care for every American. And in turn, what that's doing is it will actually eliminate all the healthcare programs we have in this country, start all over on one single system, and the cost of it would require increasing everybody's taxes 100%, and it still doesn't pay for it.
Yes,
so I mean, it's a staggeringly expensive piece of legislation. And that beep that you hear in the background is a call to vote.
So I figured I would only get a minute with you, so I understand that.
I've got a couple. I have to vote in the next 15 minutes. I've got to go run across the Capitol, but we could stick around for a couple minutes. But just so you know, the bell has been rung, so it's time to go vote.
Well, I just mentioned in passing then, and I will let you go because we're coming to a break. But you also have one on Search and Rescue Dog Protection Act,
Sure.
And that's one I'd never really realized, that if people are actually doing search and rescue things, they then aren't allowed to stay in hotels and motels. So you want to try to rectify that as well.
So as you know, I've always had a 100% meeting policy, and what's great about that is that I have so many constituents that really care about issues that are important to them. And we have a really great community in Collin County who train dogs who look for people after a natural disaster. And those are tremendous individuals, and you cannot. It just makes your heart feel good to just even talk about them. But these people, they spend their weekends and their evenings, training dogs, and they really love their dogs. And they have a great relationship with them, and then they put their dogs in a car and they drive down to Galveston to go search through wreckage and try to, save people's lives. Literally, they do that for 48 hours straight. They haven't slept. They're trying to just, go north to Houston or wherever to just, grab a meal or to take it or to go to a hotel and just crash. And they're told, "Oh, you can't come in here, sir. We don't accept dogs." And it's just kind of like, what? Like, that really happens? And it really does. In the state legislature, I was able to fix that with the unanimous piece of legislation. And I like to say it was a Republican amendment on a Democrat amendment on a Republican bill, because that's the way we do it in Texas. And so have bipartisan support.
I know you got to go vote. Van Taylor, thank you for being with us. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Since a number of presidential candidates are warning about voter suppression, it seems like a good time to accurately define the term. Let's start with a simple issue. Cutting back early voting days is not voter suppression. Early voting in North Carolina reduced the days for early voting from 17 to 10. Florida reduced their early voting days from 14 to 8. Citizens who are properly registered can still vote, but the number of days you can vote early are less. If this were an example of voter suppression, then any of the states that don't provide early voting would be guilty of voter suppression. Hope you can see the fallacy of calling this voter suppression. Now let's look at the more common complaint that voter ID laws and other voter requirements constitute voter suppression. I've documented in previous commentaries that after most of these states instituted voter laws, minority voting increased. For example, Georgia law required voters to be removed from the polls if they had not cast a ballot in 3 years and did not respond to any inquiry by mail. Even though such voters were removed from the rolls, black voter registration increased, and in the last election, African American turnout also increased. All of these facts, along with other relevant statistics, haven't prevented candidates from making claims of voter suppression. In her keynote speech at the NAACP convention last week, Senator Kamala Harris proclaimed that without voter suppression, Stacey Abrams would be governor of Georgia, Andrew Gillum, governor of Florida. For the record, Abrams lost by 54,000 votes, Gillum lost by 32,000 votes. I hope you keep some of these facts in mind, since you'll be hearing more about voter suppression from a number of candidates. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, you, of course, had an opportunity to hear what it's like to be a member of Congress. I knew that there was a vote coming up, so I wasn't sure we would have more than a segment, and that's what we got. And you can actually hear the beep when we were talking with Congressman Van Taylor, which is the call then to go and vote. And, of course, you could create a situation where individuals could vote from their office, but they've never done that. And I think there is something to be said about forcing them to come out of their office. In this case, they take the tram underground over there, then cast their vote, and then they can oftentimes go back to their constituency if they're dealing with that. And as you have noticed, that alarm is loud enough so that even somebody in their office saying, "Oh, what's that?" They realize what that is, and that sort of ends the meeting, and in this case, almost ended the interview. So that just gives you a little bit of an idea of what a member of Congress deals with on a regular basis. I'll have to look it up later, find out what the vote was, but he was anticipating that there would be a call to vote. And that's exactly what it was. I mentioned when I was talking to him something I wanted to come back to. It's a commentary that's coming out next week, but I'll give you a preview for it right now. And that is that there have been a number of complaints from some of the governors of the so-called blue states that the Trump tax reform has hurt them. Now, first of all, that only would be true if you're talking about the fact that individuals in blue states that have very high taxes aren't able to write off some of those because of that tax reform, and I think that makes a great deal of sense. But they are, in many cases, giving us rhetoric that doesn't match reality, because the reality is that many of the blue states and the state budgets of these blue states have done extremely well. And I gave you one number just a minute ago. The governor of the state of California basically was able to revise the state budget for the state of California upward by $21 billion. There'll be a $21 billion surplus that is now going to surface in California. That's even a few percentage points higher than the projection just a few months ago. And Illinois earlier this month actually has said that individual and corporate tax revenues exceeded their forecast by another $1 billion, which will probably eliminate the budget gap for that particular year. So it's, I think, really interesting to see how well these states have done. But those are not just, the exception. They're not the only examples. As I quoted to Van Taylor just a minute ago, the Pew Charitable Trusts actually did a survey and concluded that tax revenues in 41 states have hit records, that, in other words, record tax revenue, more money coming in than ever before, even when you account for inflation. So you've had revenue in blue states like California, New York, Connecticut, even state of Washington, that have done very well. And they've also been up in red states like Tennessee and Texas. And that's, I guess, one of the frustrations. Maybe sometime in the future we can talk about that with some of these members of the Texas legislature that we sent down there, because the original goal of the state of Texas, according to the governor, was to maybe have about 8% growth. And at the same time, with 8% growth, also try to have meaningful property tax reform. And that, so far, is not looking like that's going to happen. Now, you don't want to make predictions till the final bill is passed, but unless something turns around pretty quickly, it looks like all the possible additional revenue, even in a red state like Texas, is going to go into the budget rather than back into the pockets of individuals who would actually see their taxes lowered. And so that's a real concern. And by the way, to give credit where credit is due, the Pew Charitable Trusts actually in their report said that the reason we have such significant growth and such extended growth is due, they said, to the Federal Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And they specifically say that this increased revenue is due to, quote, favorable economic conditions and, quote, robust stock returns. So I think it is important to see that right now we have more revenue coming in than ever before, and yet all that revenue is simply bloating those budgets in every state, including the federal government. And if I can use an illustration, you remember Joseph in the Bible? Remember during the years of plenty, what did they do? Well, they saved back some of that grain to be prepared for those days in the future, and that prediction in the future that there would be times of famine and lean. So it seems to me right now that while American consumers are doing very well financially, this would be the time to either pay off your loans and take that extra unexpected revenue to pay off any kind of debt that you have. That's our current issue of the Outlook magazine. Or if you're not in debt, and that would be rare, that'd be our family, but not very many others, to put money in savings. And unfortunately, that's not what is being done in the individual level. And the same thing I would want to say to any state, whether it's the state of California, state of Texas, Tennessee, Washington, Connecticut, whoever you might be out there, there is going to be a time when if you have a budget at this amount, you won't have the revenue coming in that you have right now. So this would be a perfect time to either, if you're in Illinois, to begin to bolster some of those government pensions and things like that. And then there are other opportunities that if indeed you are okay with the pensions, then you could certainly begin to put together what many states, including the state of Texas, have, and that's called a rainy day fund. And the rainy day fund is for what do you do when, for example, it's a rainy day, or when you have a hurricane, or you have a tornado, or you have unexpected expenses, or in one way or another, your income doesn't match your expenses. And so, if nothing else, those are just a couple of things I thought I would talk about in terms of finances. Let me take a phone call real quickly, and then I want to get into some other stories that we need to talk about. So we'll go to the state of Idaho, I believe it is. Patrick, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, hello. Thank you so much for taking my call, Kerby. How are you today?
I'm good. You calling from Idaho?
That's correct.
Yep.
I'm out here in Genesee, Idaho. That's correct. I'm a big fan of yours. I loved your book. That's how I came across you, your book about the religious perspective on homosexuality.
Well, thank you. So what's your question for us today, or comment?
Well, I'm just watching on the live stream, by the way. It's really cool how you do the video live stream. I get to see you. You're looking really good today, sir. You look really nice, well put together.
Yeah, well, I'll wave on that, and some people that don't want to see that don't have to watch the live stream. Nick Pitts always says, I'm sorry you have to see me on screen, but that's something we implemented years ago. So I think you had a question about, was it Donald Trump, or what's on your mind today?
I mean, I'm not sorry I see you. I'm kind of well known. I'm known as the Fat Master. I like to sort of call these shows and I guess batch off while I watch or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Any comments? If not, we're going to go on. Okay. Well, again, I guess we'll just take a break, and then when we come back, I'm going to get into some other issues. So that is the case. So let me, if I can, just mention that when we come back from the break, I'll spend a little bit more time talking about a variety of other issues, and one of those is the issue of crime at the border. We're going to be talking with our good friend Terence Jeffery, and he'll be getting into that. We also have the book Rethinking Sexuality by Juli Slattery. And so those are just a couple of issues that we will get into. And before the program is over in the third hour today, David Rubin will be joining us, and we'll be talking about what is happening in the Middle East. But he's also written a very good piece that came out months ago on the fact that walls work. You know, we have a very good example of that in Israel. And a lot of people that have been telling us for some time, you know what, a wall doesn't work. And he will certainly disagree with you on that. Having been the mayor of Shiloh, he can talk about how walls have prevented terrorism, have prevented various kinds of actions against the nation of Israel. So we're going to do some of those topics as well. But let me just mention, as we're working our way through some of the conversation today, one of the other topics I want to get to is the issue of voter suppression. And that is one of my Viewpoints commentaries. So if you would like to read that, it is available on our website. And of course, as I've mentioned before, there is a way in which you can take the time to not only read that, but also subscribe to it so that you will receive it in your inbox. My commentaries come to your inbox Monday through Friday. Penedexter's comes on Saturday. And I do want to thank Penedexter for covering the show on Monday. And of course, Nick Pitts was the host on Tuesday for the Millennial Roundtable. So we have a lot more to cover. When I come back, I want to talk a bit more about some of these other issues we're going to be getting into today. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate two replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me give you a program note. Next hour, we're going to be talking with Juli Slattery. Her book is entitled Rethinking Sexuality, and she'll be on with us for about a half an hour. She's got a great point, and that is the church may be teaching us what to think about sex, but the world is training us on how to think about sex, and really says the world has been discipling us, which I thought was kind of an interesting turn of phrase that she has used. And this is a book that I wanted to get to for some time. It's amazing to me the people that endorsed it. First of all, the forward by Chip Ingram, who's been on the program with us. Dan Allender has been on the program with us. Linda Dillow, just mentioned her husband, Jody Dillow, the other day, and of course I've known her for decades. John Trent's been on the program with us. John Dickerson has been on with us. Greg Smalley, as well as, Del Tackett, Josh McDowell. So many people love this book, and so we're going to spend some time talking about that in the first half hour, next hour, and then the last half hour of the next hour, we'll be talking with Terence Jeffery of CNS News, because this relates to a commentary that you might want to look at. In May 6th, I talk about some of the material that he's put together, reminding us of the crime at the border. You know, there's a couple ways to evaluate whether or not we have a crisis at the border. One is to look at the number of people that have crossed the border illegally. 1 month it was 76,000. The next month it was 100,000. Doesn't that qualify as a crisis? I think so. But he uses a different number, and that is to look at the number of people that have come across the border with dangerous intentions. And as the editor-in-chief of CNS News, he brings so many good facts and figures and statistics, which is why I like to quote him, and points out that if you look at the 5 federal district courts that have the greatest number of individuals in terms of convictions and sentencing, they all sit on the border. They would be the Western District of Texas, the Southern District of Texas, the Southern District of California, and the districts of Arizona and New Mexico. So I think it illustrates only so well. Those are the courts where the greatest amount of activity is taking place, because that's where so many people are actually being sentenced and actually imprisoned for crimes that were conducted there. So that should tell you a great deal. So we're going to get into that all in the next hour, and I hope that you can join us then. Let me also mention that when we sometimes spend some time talking about the place of God and the place of religion in the public square, there are a couple things to remind us. First of all, that we're going to be facing more and more persecution or more criticism. And there are 2 ways to illustrate that. The first is to go back and mention something I would have mentioned if I was on the program on Monday. Since I haven't been on since last Friday, I thought I would mention it today on a Wednesday. And that is, there was a very good commencement speech delivered at Liberty University by Mike Pence. By the way, Mike Pence is also supposed to deliver the commencement address at Taylor University, where there's all sorts of controversy. Isn't that amazing? But nevertheless, I'll leave that for another day. But the speech by the vice president was one in which he was really expressing the fact that we are going to probably face a great deal of hostility in the public arena, because he says essentially that the days of easy Christianity in America are over. People of faith, for example, he points out, have shaped this country since its founding, but things have begun to change. And Gary Bauer even argues in his piece, where he does kind of a summary of Mike Pence, Vice President Mike Pence's speech, to say that the change really, he thinks, accelerated during the Obama presidency. That's not what Mike Pence said, but I think he probably agrees with that as well, especially as the government tried to force various Christian groups to go along with certain edicts that came down from them. And, of course, we saw this in various states as well. And if you are unfamiliar to any of that, just simply listen on a Friday weekend edition when we have, for example, Kelly Shackelford, or if he can't be here, Jeremy Dice, or somebody else from First Liberty. We oftentimes spend some time talking about so many of those religious liberty cases. So Gary Bauer goes on to say that the current administration, under, of course, President Donald Trump and Vice President Mike Pence, are reversing some of those trends. But he also points out that a lot of what is happening is unrelated to the government, because, as Gary Bauer points out, until recently, being known as a good Christian was oftentimes seen as an advantage to your career, a signal that you were deserving of trust and respect. But Mike Pence warned these young Christian graduates at Liberty University that their faith may cost them their job if they take their Christianity seriously on issues like, say, the sanctity of human life or the meaning of marriage. And so he said he really wanted to prepare them to be mocked and to even face some of the kind of criticism his own wife faced simply because she was going to be teaching at Emmanuel Christian School. Here are just a couple of real quick quotes from the vice president. He said, quote, "Some of the loudest voices for tolerance today have little tolerance for traditional Christian beliefs. So as you go about your daily life, be just ready. Because you're going to be asked not just to tolerate things that violate your faith, you're going to be asked to endorse them. You're going to be asked to bow down to the idols of popular culture." So that was one of the quotes from the vice president. Let me give you one more and we'll move on. So he says, "So class of 2019, my word to all of you is to decide here and now that you're going to stand firm, that you're going to persevere, that you'll always be prepared to give a reason for the hope that you have, and you'll do it with gentleness and respect." Of course, that is a quote from Scripture. "Because our nation and our world need your message of grace and love maybe now more than ever before." So if nothing else, just wanted to give credit to the vice president. Don't know if I'll quote that in the next hour, but I just thought it was a great reminder of what we're heading into. And just before I take our next break, let's talk about the fact that there is now a tradition in the House run by the Democrats to take out the phrase "under God, so help me God." Because oftentimes when you're engaged in giving testimony, you raise your right hand, you're swearing in, but "so help me God" is now been removed. And a good example of that unfolded just the other day. If you've seen the video, and this comes from our good friend Jerry Newcomb, you have Democratic Representative Steve Cohen from Tennessee, who is the chairman of this particular committee. Cohen is best remembered as the congressman eating KFC in a publicity stunt. But nevertheless, let's go on. So anyway, Cohen asked some of the witnesses about to testify, "Do you swear or affirm under penalty or perjury that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief?" Well, at this point, there's a pause, whereas all of a sudden, Representative Michael Johnson, who's a Republican, by the way, Cohen, of course, is a Democrat, Michael Johnson from Louisiana politely says, "I got a parliamentary inquiry." He says, "I think you left out the phrase, 'so help me God.'" And then he got pretty rough because Cohen says, "We did." And Johnson asked if the witness would swear in again, but this time with the traditional phrase, "so help me God." Chairman Cohen shakes his head no, if they want to, but some of them don't want to. And so then Johnson tries to explain, well, it goes back to our founding history. It's been part of our tradition for more than 2 centuries, and I don't know that we should abandon it right now. Cohen looks at Johnson with a face that seems to communicate like, "What planet are you from?" And then Johnson adds, "Could I ask the witness if they would choose to use the phrase?" Then Representative Gerald Nadler, we've seen him lately, shut down the whole discussion, saying, "We do not have religious tests for office or anything else, and we should let it go at that." Well, I will also mention that at least we were going to post a little piece. Yeah, we did, by Jeremy Dice, who I thought was really good, pointing out the fact that now this is really interesting because if there's any particular political party that's had a problem with this issue of religious tests, it's the Democrat Party. But nevertheless, this is, I think, kind of an interesting point. And interesting enough, Jerry Newcomb says, "I once interviewed Michael Johnson for Christian television. As an attorney, he specializes in religious liberty, told me, can the government acknowledge the role of God in human affairs? Now we know that the founders have always done that since the beginning, the founding of the nation, so the answer is yes." And then Johnson also answered, "Americans intuitively have an appreciation for absolute truth and justice. We were programmed that way by our Creator, and that's what the founders acknowledged from the very beginning." And he says, "The enemies of the faith would have us remove all vestiges of Christianity, all vestiges of the Bible, of God from the public square. And that's not what the Constitution says, and that's not what we're required to do." So if nothing else, this little dust-up over whether or not "so help me God" should stay in the particular swearing in is a foregone conclusion as it comes to Democratic control of the House of Representatives. And this, I think, is just one more illustration of the fact that it used to be just assumed that people believed in God, and even if they didn't, they'd at least go along with this. Even if they did want to say, "so help me God," they would just do so, simply not to ruffle feathers. And now it's been eliminated from the swearing in, in the House of Representatives, at least under the rule of Democrats. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention the next hour we're going to talk about rethinking sexuality for about half of the time, and then the other half of the time talking about crime on the border and some other immigration issues that Terence Jeffery will get into. If you would like to join us in the third hour, David Rubin's going to be with us, and he is the former mayor of Shiloh, talking about what has happened in the Middle East. Anti-Semitism is certainly, I know, something we will get into with him as well, but also how anybody that says a wall doesn't work have never been to Israel. And I might just mention, while we're talking about that, you can still go to Israel with us on the right-hand corner. There's just a little box right there right now. Go to Israel with Kerby. And we have, I think, had a few more people sign up, but we still have a little bit room for you. We filled up the first bus. We have a second bus that we will be taking to Israel, and then we'll move on from Israel to Rome. You can go just to Israel or to Israel and to Rome with us, and I think it is just a great opportunity for you to participate with us. And so take the time to visit the website pointofview.net. One of the comments I get from people from time to time is, you know what, I think we need to investigate the investigators. Well, that apparently is exactly what the Attorney General William Barr is doing, because he's tapped an individual by the name of John Durham. Now, if you're not familiar with him, and I was not, but I've read a lot about him since his name kind of surfaced. And first of all, he is an individual that is originally from Connecticut. I understand he's a Red Sox fan, But he, and I can go through the long list, but I won't, just since we're in a short segment here, talk about the various investigations he has done. And it's helpful because in some respects, Democrats have been very supportive of him in the past. Now they can turn on him sort of like they did Robert Mueller, but it'll be interesting to see because he is investigating and has been charged with investigating the origins of the Donald Trump Russia collusion investigation, or what some people call the Russia collusion hoax. And he's had, as Gary Bauer points out, a reputation of being a hard-charging bulldog. I've looked at a list of some of the most notable events that he's been involved with, one in which, even interestingly enough, in an indirect way, also involved Robert Mueller, but other very detailed investigations of FBI malfeasance. So he's the kind of guy you bring in when you're wondering if there's been some misconduct in the Justice Department, in the FBI, or in the CIA. And he has handled sensitive investigations of government corruption under both Republican administrations and Democrat administrations. And he's been also already investigating some of these media links from the deep state. Well, don't take our word for it. One of the individuals that we've quoted on this program from time to time is a man by the name of John Yoo. And he has, of course, been a law professor, but also was a Justice Department lawyer. And he was on with Laura Ingraham the other night on Fox News, interestingly enough. And here's what he said. He said, you wouldn't go with a U.S. attorney like Durham, someone of his stature, unless the attorney general thinks actually something criminal might have happened, that someone might have violated the law, that there might have been malfeasance, that people at the FBI or the Justice Department were acting out of partisan motives, not just out of incompetence or stupidity. So we'll see where this takes us, but that is certainly the case, and probably one of the reasons why you have William Barr appointing him is you might remember a while back there was another individual by the name of John Huber who was appointed by the previous Attorney General, that'd be Jeff Sessions, to investigate potential FBI abuses, and that took place more than a year ago. And I love Gary Bauer says, yet no one has heard from him since. So, and matter of fact, one of the things he suggests is that the Senate Judiciary Chairman Lindsey Graham ought to demand an update on what Huber's doing because he's supposedly investigating and nobody's heard anymore. Now, maybe he's got some great material to drop in the laps of Congress, but so far, not much has been heard. And so maybe this has been the desire on the part of William Barr, the current Attorney General, to get somebody who's more of a bulldog and is going to start turning over stones and figuring out what actually took place. Let me just, as a program note, mention that tomorrow we're going to spend a fair amount of time talking about China. You may have been listening to the program and you're saying, China's in the news. You guys haven't said a thing about it. Well, we're going to spend almost the entire time tomorrow talking about China. And first of all, we're going to talk about the economic issues involved with that, and Jerry Tuma will be sitting in with us. But also, just before we take a break, I thought I might mention that, we're not just looking at the economic issues of tariffs. We're also going to spend some time trying to look at some of the political issues as well, and the military issues. And so here are just a couple. And again, we'll go into this in a lot more detail tomorrow, but I wanted to give you kind of a preview of coming attractions. First of all, one of the things we want to talk about is how China has been, of course, building up its military, but it also has been fortifying islands, even kind of building kind of temporary islands and developing all sorts of advanced weapons. It also has been launching all sorts of cyber attacks against the United States. As a matter of fact, during the time when President Obama was in office, China stole the records of more than 20 million government employees. That can't be good. Then, of course, you have these hackers that have also put the U.S. Navy under siege. As a matter of fact, a recent report on the hacking of the Navy warned that China had derived an incalculable near and long-term military advantage from their hacking, thereby altering the calculus or the balance of global powers. So those are just a few things that I want to bring as in a separate segment. But then we're also going to talk a little bit about what this has happened in terms of jobs, the tariffs, of also just the stealing of U.S. technology and all sorts of intellectual property. And then I want to talk a little bit about even Chinese propaganda, because you have on various college campuses around the country some of these what you might call propaganda centers. They're called Confucius Institutes. Well, that sounds pretty tame until you realize that they're funded by the Chinese Communist Party. And the federal government, by the way, has now become so concerned about the possible spying that these institutes are doing that the Pentagon, the Defense Department, has decided to cut funding to universities that host these Confucius Institutes. Isn't that something? And then, of course, you have all sorts of other espionage. You might remember the FBI Director Christopher Wray recently, when he was giving testimony, said the Chinese counterintelligence threat is more deep, more diverse, more vexing, more challenging, more comprehensive, and more concerning than any other counterintelligence threat I can think of. And, of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that China is probably one of the worst human rights abusers. And China used to be pretty free. I mean, this time last year, I had individuals encouraging me to maybe go over to China and to teach in some of the churches and some of the Christian schools. Nobody's calling for me to do that now. The persecution of Christians in China has picked up dramatically in the last year, and very few Christians are traveling to China. Many Christians that are in China are suffering, and so this is a good illustration of this engagement that the president is dealing with and has initiated. And we're going to spend some time tomorrow talking with Jerry Tuma, talking about the tariffs, talking about the impact on the economy. What does that mean even for your own finances? Could this crash the stock market? Just a lot of things we're going to get into. And then I'll also try to look at some of the counterterrorism issues and the whole issue of hacking and the military threats as well. So China will be a big issue tomorrow, and we're going to take some time to really devote our entire focus to what is happening in China and how to respond. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, we're going to change topics, as we will do a lot today, as we get into the issue of rethinking sexuality. All that coming up right after this.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of view can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
You know, one of the topics we address so often here on Point of View is sexuality, because whether it's homosexuality, premarital sex, or whether it's the issue of gender confusion or whatever, that is a topic we address on a regular basis. And our next guest is really making the case that the church may be teaching us what to think about sex, but the world is training us on how to think about sex. And I love our friend John Trent said this: if you're anything like me, you've never expected to see the two words sexual and discipleship paired together. But that's exactly what we're going to be talking about for the next couple of minutes as we bring to the microphone Dr. Juli Slattery, author of this book, God's Design and Why It Matters, Rethinking Sexuality. Individual who holds degrees in psychology from Wheaton College, Biola University, the Florida Institute of Technology, former co-host of the Focus on the Family broadcast, and a co-founder of the Authentic Intimacy with Linda Dillow, an individual I've known for many decades now. And I might just mention that this book is endorsed by Chip Ingram, who's been on the program with us, as well as Dan Allender, Linda Dillow, John Trent, John Dickerson, Josh McDowell, and others that have all been on the program. So, Dr. Juli Slattery, thank you so very much for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Let's, if we can, get into this interesting putting two words together. We've been sexually discipled by the world. That's the first kind of grabber, and it hits you as you've turned almost the first page of the book.
Yeah, well, that's the intention. I've been working in the ministry, Authentic Intimacy, for the last 7 or 8 years, exclusively teaching women about sexuality and sexual issues. And what I've found going from city to city, church to church, is that even women that have been really discipled in their faith don't know how to think biblically about sexuality. And I don't think that's exclusive to women. As I've interacted with even leaders and pastors in the church, they really have received very little teaching and training on how to think biblically about sexual issues. And that's becoming very evident today as our understanding of sexuality is so challenged by the culture.
You know, as a teacher, both in seminaries and Bible colleges occasionally, I found that we've gone from a time where nobody was even probably thinking about the issue of homosexuality to that becoming front and center, to then now the whole issue of transgender and gender fluidity and all of that. And it does seem to me that maybe the future graduates of Bible colleges and Christian schools and seminaries will be trained. But until we get that kind of training, until people read this particular book and others that you've put together, there's just a real need for teaching. And yet, as you well know, part of the problem is we say, well, not sure I even want to talk about the subject of sex in a church. And yet, if we don't, then the other side is, as you said, discipling us, right?
Yeah, that's very true. We've grown up with a heritage and a tradition that you don't talk about sex in church. And what people walk away believing then is that God must not have much to say on the topic, or he doesn't care about our sexuality. And like you just mentioned, the culture doesn't shy away from talking very openly and often about how we should be viewing sexual issues. But I think that is beginning to change. As you mentioned, generations to come may receive training on how to handle issues like pornography or homosexuality. But I think even that is inadequate because that's more of a problem-solving approach. You know, how do we get rid of sin? How do we confront the culture. But what I'm really advocating in this book is that discipleship means that we have to have a deep understanding of why sexuality matters in the first place, that our conversation can't be about a problem. It has to be about the territory of sexuality.
And that's kind of the premise of your book, and that is this isn't just an issue to be resolved, it's territory to retake. And it kind of gets us into one of the things you talk about, why the sexual revolution worked. For our younger individuals, we do a millennial roundtable on Tuesdays, and they probably have always been in the midst of the sexual revolution. For those of us, and I guess I'm the old one around the table, we can remember a time before the sexual revolution, but today it's just assumed that people are going to be sexually involved. They're going to assume that you are already going to have seen pornography. You probably are going to be tolerant about homosexuality, maybe even about some of the gender issues. And so in some respects, that's why there's so much more work to do than there might have been, say, back in the 1950s, don't you think?
Absolutely. We've really made a shift in our culture that people like Francis Schaeffer predicted, that we would become a culture that doesn't recognize or fear God. And if you even look at media, say in the 1980s or 1990s, there was a sense that although certainly not everyone was a Christian or would believe in the Bible, we were by and large a God-fearing society that believed that there's a God out there that has an external authority that we all agree to and submit to. And that included our sexuality, that we defined a life based on a moral understanding of God creating life, that we define marriage as the union between man and a woman because that is what's expressed not only in the Bible but in other religious respected traditions. So now we're in a place where we've essentially said, if you think God exists, good for you, but as a culture, we don't acknowledge any authority outside of our own experience and outside of our own authentic beliefs as individuals. And once you do that, everybody gets to create their own meaning for everything, including sexuality, gender, relationships, marriage. And so the sexual revolution is really an outgrowth of a much bigger movement towards humanism and valuing the individual above community or any other authority.
Let's take a break, but when we come back, I want to get into this in a little more detail. But again, this is a book that is out, and I do recommend it. It is published by Multnomah. I just mentioned all the individuals that have endorsed it, and it is broken into 4 sections. The first, which we sort of mentioned just briefly here, New Paradigm Sexual Discipleship. And then the next 3 sections talk about, first of all, looking upward, knowing what we believe, looking inward, living what we believe, and looking outward, passing on what we believe. And we'll just dip into some of that and maybe come back to this idea of, if you really tell me what you believe about God, it also maybe helps me understand what you should or probably do think about sexuality. And as you are maybe listening to this, you might say, this would be something I'd like to study, or maybe this would be something we could do with a small group. So we have a link to AuthenticIntimacy.com. If you go to the books section, you will see an opportunity to order the book. But there's also a small group guide, which allows for a 7-week study that is available. There's also an e-course that is available as well with videos and those kinds of things. And while you're there, you might also benefit from some of the other books, Sex and the Single Girl, or 25 Questions You Were Afraid to Ask, or a variety of others that are available at AuthenticIntimacy.com. We have that on our website, and you can find it and also benefit from it as well. We come back, though, we'll talk a little bit about looking upward. How does our view of God affect our view of our perception of sexuality? And we'll continue our conversation with Dr. Juli Slattery right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Since a number of presidential candidates are warning about voter suppression, it seems like a good time to accurately define the term. Let's start with a simple issue. Cutting back early voting days is not voter suppression. Early voting in North Carolina reduced the days for early voting from 17 to 10. Florida reduced their early voting days from 14 to 8. Citizens who are properly registered can still vote, but the number of days you can vote early are less. If this were an example of voter suppression, then any of the states that don't provide early voting would be guilty of voter suppression. Hope you can see the fallacy of calling this voter suppression. Now let's look at the more common complaint that voter ID laws and other voter requirements constitute voter suppression. I've documented in previous commentaries that after most of these states instituted voter laws, minority voting increased. For example, Georgia law required voters to be removed from the polls if they had not cast a ballot in 3 years and did not respond to any inquiry by mail. Even though such voters were removed from the rolls, black voter registration increased, and in the last election, African American turnout also increased. All of these facts, along with other relevant statistics, haven't prevented candidates from making claims of voter suppression. In her keynote speech at the NAACP convention last week, Senator Kamala Harris proclaimed that without voter suppression, Stacey Abrams would be governor of Georgia, Andrew Gillum, governor of Florida. For the record, Abrams lost by 54,000 votes, Gillum lost by 32,000 votes. I hope you keep some of these facts in mind, since you'll be hearing more about voter suppression from a number of candidates. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
One of the important sections in this book is this idea of looking upward, knowing what we believe. The book is entitled Rethinking Sexuality, God's Design and Why It Matters. Dr. Juli Slattery with us. And let's, if we can, talk about the link between God and sexuality, and even maybe the link between sexuality and God's covenant love, because this idea of covenant is important. And probably a foreign concept today in a society that everybody says, I do my own thing. You know, marriage should last as long as love shall last, but until death do us apart is not something we necessarily even hear sometimes in the marriage vows anymore. So we need to come back to some of these basic biblical principles, don't we?
We do. A lot of Christians, although they might know what God says is okay related to sexuality, what he calls sexual sin, they can't explain why. When somebody said, well, why would God care if two people sleep together if they're not married? And often we don't know how to answer that. We just go back to because the Bible says so. And, what I tell people is that good parenting never ends with because I said so, that a parent will explain the why. And I really believe in the pages of Scripture there is a why that most of us don't know or really understand in depth. And it's this idea that you've brought up, that sexuality was created to always be connected with this idea of covenant love. And so our sexual desires, even as a single person, are what drive us to pursue a covenant relationship with someone. It's your body's way of saying that I wasn't created to be alone. And sexual intimacy within marriage is, Timothy Keller would call it like a covenant renewal ceremony, that it's the celebration of the covenant promise, where you do with your body what you have promised to do with your whole life. Give yourself completely to the other person. and that even sexual faithfulness is the promise of covenant, that I'm giving myself solely, exclusively to you. And what's so key about that, and it's hard to explain it in a short period of time, is that that's a metaphor for God's covenant love for us, for his people. That God, even the scripture says that Jesus is like the husband that pursues a wife, that makes a covenant with her, that is constantly looking out for her good and sacrificing himself for her. And even our worship is an element of celebrating that covenant. We look forward to heaven when we'll be unified with our bridegroom. And so there's all this imagery in Scripture that really explains why sexuality is such a sacred category, why it's not just something that you can choose to do however you want, but it's really linked closely to God's heart.
Well, I just mentioned that chapter that deals with God's covenant, and then covenant marriage and those kinds of things, and what that means is excellent. But I want to keep moving because I did want to focus on something else that I thought was very significant, and that is on a number of occasions, Julie, we've talked about people that are sexually broken. We've had individuals here talking about pornography. We've had others that have talked about abuse. But one of the things that might be riveting to a few of our individuals that maybe you've even heard those programs is the section you have on why everyone is sexually broken. People might say, oh, no, not me. But you say we're sexually broken because we live in a fallen world. We all have been sexually harmed by sin, and we have all sinned sexually. And so in some respects, the beginning point to renewal and the beginning point to rethinking sexuality and about this issue is to start with the issue that sometimes is hard for us to manage, to even acknowledge, and that is that everyone is sexually broken.
Yeah, some of your listeners are even like, really? You have to explain that to me. Part of it is our understanding of brokenness comes from our understanding of wholeness. And I think in the church we've sold a very cheap version of what sexual wholeness is supposed to look like. We say essentially save yourself for marriage, and then you'll get married someday, and then you're supposed to have sex in marriage, and it should be somewhat fun. And that's our definition of wholeness. When you look in Scripture and you really understand the fullness of God's metaphor creation of sexuality, you start to understand that sexual wholeness is so much richer than we've ever been taught. So, for example, a husband and wife that maybe they were even virgins when they got married, but their sexual relationship is filled with conflict, or it's about the wife performing her duty for her husband, and that's the extent of it. That's not the fullness of what God designed. You just look at Song of Solomon, and you see that God designed sexual intimacy to be full of passion for both people, and that it's something that's binding them together, that it's fun, that it's full of pleasure. And so there's lots of examples around us of people that are technically doing the right thing sexually, but they're not experiencing the fullness of what God designed sexuality to be. And so I really do believe that our conversations, both within the church and in our culture, have to begin with the humility of everybody saying, I don't 100% do what God says either. And there's restoration that's needed in my life. There's healing that's needed in my sexuality, because we've approached these conversations so often with an us versus them mentality. Like, we've got it all together, we're doing it right, and the world is doing everything wrong. And in the Scripture, Jesus had harsh words for people that approached any spiritual topic with that paradigm of we have it and you don't. He essentially said, none of you have it. You all need my redemption. You're saving yourself for marriage isn't what makes you pure. It's the blood of Jesus Christ and his righteousness that makes us whole and pure. And so, I think we need to, again, rethink how we're approaching sexual brokenness by just saying some people are broken and the rest of us are whole.
Julie, one of the things that I like to always do is talk to those in positions of leadership. And I think it is striking that everybody from Chip Ingram to Dan Allender to John Trent to Josh McDowell and all sorts of other individuals who are teachers have endorsed your book. But there are many times people that listen to this program and say, this would be something I'd like to teach in a small group setting, or I'd like to teach in my Bible fellowship, my Sunday school class. Maybe even a pastor would like to address it from the pulpit. And at the end of your book, book, each one of your 12 chapters have about 7 or 8 questions, and that probably would be sufficient to use this as a discussion. But in addition to this, there is a way where people can go on your website, they can get a sample chapter for free and see for themselves what it is. But more importantly, there are small group curricula. There's all sorts of ways in which some of our individuals would like to teach this in their small group or their church. So talk about what are some of those things that are available at your website.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for giving me the opportunity to share. I guess the first place I'd point you is the small group curriculum. It's 7 weeks, and each week has about a 15-minute TED Talk of me teaching on a paradigm shift, and it's 7 paradigm shifts to rethinking sexuality. So one of the paradigm shifts we've just covered, which is we're all sexually broken. Most people don't think that way. The paradigm shift of even thinking of sexuality in a discipleship context. So that small group curriculum lays out some teaching for you, as well as a discussion guide that goes with the teaching and the book if you wanted to read the book as well. So that's a great place to start.
And I might just mention that when you go there, some of your other books, Sex and the Single Girl, Passion, Pursuit, of course, 25 questions you're afraid to ask about love, sex, and intimacy. Some of those you've written with Linda Dillow. Of course, I've known Jodi Dillow for, 4 decades now. I've known her, too, as well. But just a great individual to co-author with. And just some resources that people would find. But as they go to the website, some people might say, well, we're thinking of doing a women's conference, or we're thinking about doing a couples conference. There's a place where they can contact you and maybe have you come and speak. Isn't that true?
Yeah, that's right. So we do women's events, but also church events on this topic of rethinking sexuality and leader trainings, because I just have seen more and more that leaders are struggling with this. They don't have help in their own lives, and they, as you mentioned, they never received this kind of training in seminary. So our heart is just to equip the church and provide whatever resources we can as you're doing the work of sharing the gospel even within the context of sexual issues.
Well, again, let me just mention the book is entitled Rethinking Sexuality. Dr. Juli Slattery with us. And again, a foreword by Gary Thomas, who's also been on the program, also endorsements by many of the people I just mentioned a minute ago. It is published by Multnomah. Probably can find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we've got a way in which you can order it either in paperback or in Kindle. And of course, we have a link to your website, Authentic Intimacy. And so if you would like any more of that information, it's all available at our website, pointofview.net. Juli, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
All right. Thanks so much, Kerby. I appreciate it.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to change topics. This is going to be one where we're going to have all sorts of different topics every half hour. So if you find yourself interested in one or not interested in one, just stay tuned, because we're going to get into some really important issues. Terence Jeffery is going to be with us when we come back. And he has put together some really interesting, I think, helpful facts on the issue of immigration, in particular illegal immigration. I did a commentary that came out on May 6th on crime at the border, so we'll get talking with him about that. And most importantly, I want to open up the phones, because you've already heard me talk on these issues, and you may want to ask him some questions, because he brings a lot to the table, and we'll do that with him right after this.
So you sit down and you do your budget, and you look at all your monthly costs, your bills, your income, and it seems like there's never quite enough. You know what would help? What would really help? Finding $500 a month to help balance things out. And that is the typical savings, $500 a month for a family when you switch to MediShare for your health care. MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry, and it works. No wonder more than 400,000 people are doing this now. And look, whether you're single or married or you have kids, this can make sitting down to do a monthly budget a lot more fun. Just think what you could do with $500 a month. That can cover a car payment or pay back loans or whatever. Join MediShare and go out to dinner to celebrate. Find out more. The MediShare people are so easy to talk to. They can answer any questions. They are super friendly. Call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
Tired of fake news? Support truth. Join Point of View's Truth Team and bring healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, or 800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you listen to this program any length of time, you know that oftentimes I'm quoting from Terry Jeffery because he is, of course, an individual that brings so many facts and figures to the conversation. And it just occurred to me, I thought, why don't we get him on sometime? My May 6th issue, for example, the commentary that I did there was called Crime on the Border. And it was really based on some of the material that he put together on the 5 federal courts on the Mexican border that lead the nation in criminal convictions. And, of course, I thought it would just be good for you to have a chance to hear from him and also ask some questions if you would like to do so. If you're not familiar, Terence Jeffery is the editor-in-chief of CNS News, an individual that graduated from Princeton, also has studied at American University as well as Georgetown University, served as the editorial writer for the Washington Times, and has been on the program with us back when Marlon Maddox was the host, and of course even when I've been the host, and Penna Dexter and others. But his work is always something we like to rely on. And so, Terry Jeffery, thank you for joining us today for Point of View.
Kerby, thanks very much for having me on.
Well, the other day, I took your material. I'd first heard you do it with, I think, with Sean Hannity, and then we did a whole commentary on when we look at the various border states, the various districts, the busy federal court districts all are along the U.S.-Mexican border. That'd be the Western District of Texas, the Southern District of Texas, the Southern District of California, the districts of Arizona and New Mexico. And I think that gives us a good opportunity to recognize why there's a crisis at the border, not just that 100,000 people, immigrants, are crossing the border illegally sometimes in a month, but the fact that the places where are the busiest federal courts because of various individuals being convicted and sentenced are all along the border of the United States.
Yeah, they are. Yeah, to put it in perspective, Kerby, there's 94 U.S. court districts around the country and 94 U.S. attorneys that are out there prosecuting cases. People go so long that when you look at it statistically, and I got the data from the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts, this comes from the judicial branch. It doesn't come from the executive branch or Congress. This comes from the courts themselves. The 5 U.S. court districts out of the 94 total that by far convict and send to prison the largest number of criminals are the 5 that lie along the border, which, as you say, that stretches all the way from San Diego all the way across the Gulf of Mexico, includes the Southern District of California, the District of Arizona, the District of New Mexico, the Western District of Texas, and the Southern District of Texas. And of those districts, the worst is the Western District of Texas, where last year more than 7,100 criminals were arrested, charged, convicted, and sentenced to prison for serious crimes. And although a lot of those crimes have to do with immigration, a lot of them also have to do with smuggling drugs, with sex offenses, with violent crimes. There are crimes that have to come under the jurisdiction of a federal court rather than a state court. But, I mean, to put it that another way in perspective is there are more than 5 times as many serious criminals convicted and sent to prison from the Western District of Texas, which is largely rural, than there were from the Southern District of New York that includes Manhattan.
And again, just to get a perspective on that, we do have that article, and you can actually see that graph, and we could pop it up right now, but you can see how disproportionate those particular 5 districts are compared to the rest of the country. And you said something in passing, but it's worth reemphasizing that, yes, some people might say, well, yeah, they're convicted because of illegal immigration. No, these are individuals being convicted because they're part of a drug cartel, because they were smuggling migrants, because they're human traffickers. These are the kind of people you don't want inside our border. True?
No, true. I mean, there's such. And here's another way of putting it in perspective. When you look at the federal court jurisdictions, these 94 jurisdictions, they don't bring cases that they don't think they can convict. But overwhelmingly, they win a conviction when the U.S. attorney brings the case. There's some percentage of those, though, that they don't send into prison. They get a suspended sentence or they get a fine. I'm talking here about criminals that are apprehended by federal law enforcement that U.S. attorneys say, we're going to charge this guy because we know we can get a conviction. But these are crimes where they feel they must send these people to federal prison. And this is massively disproportionately happening along the U.S. border. Quite frankly, it not only hurts the quality of life for people living on the American side of the border that this kind of crime is going on. It hurts the quality of life for people on the Mexican side of the border because this porous border that these criminals, many of whom are part of organized crime syndicates, know that the border is porous, know that they have a chance of getting away with these crimes, and that's why they're committing these crimes at the U.S. border. And that's the fault of the U.S. government. We ought to be enforcing the border so that these crimes aren't happening in the first place.
Might just mention that we do have a link on our website. You can go to pointofview.net or you can go to cnsnews.com, either way. And you might want to go there and actually bookmark it so that you can find some of those other articles. But one more point that I might make, because when people hear this, they go, well, maybe that's due to the fact that these are people being prosecuted just for illegal immigration. No, these are also drug cartels and smugglers and traffickers and things like that. But some might say, well, maybe that's just a one-off. But you point out that we can go all the way back to 1959, and the Office of U.S. Attorneys has published an annual statistical report. You can go back and see whether or not that pattern is just a one-off, just happened to happen during the Trump administration, or whether this has been a problem for some time, can't you?
It has. It's been going on. In fact, ever since I've been a journalist in Washington, D.C., I read to say I periodically have looked at this problem, and I've looked at these statistics. And in this call, I went back and I noted that. And people, if they're interested, they themselves can go to the Justice Department website and look at those annual statistical reports that are published by the U.S. attorneys and see the pattern is just overwhelming. I can tell you, anecdotally, I mean, this isn't something that's scientific like the data. We have the data. It's absolutely incontrovertible. But anecdotally, you talk to assistant U.S. attorneys, people involved with federal law enforcement, they all know this. They've known this for years, that the people who are really prosecuting the crimes and the serious crimes, it's done on the border. And there's some U.S. attorneys districts where they almost prosecute no crimes to send people to federal prison. But when you're talking about West Texas, Southern Texas, Southern California, Arizona, and New Mexico, lots of crime, serious crime, people are going to prison.
One other point I thought I'd just make before we take a break, and I've heard you also go and look at the various senatorial and congressional districts of individuals that want to continue to have sanctuary cities or sanctuary states. And you found something interesting, because there are certain individuals who, because of their wealth, because they're wealthy members of Congress, maybe are, if you will, insulated from some of the kind of experiences that when I get calls from people that live near the Texas border, the New Mexico or Arizona border, they have a different set of experiences than some of these wealthy members of Congress.
Yeah, I tell you, I happen to be a native San Franciscan. That's my hometown. And 2 of the 10 wealthiest members of the United States Congress are residents of San Francisco, namely House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senator Dianne Feinstein. They both are incredibly wealthy. They obviously live very nice lifestyles in San Francisco. Personally, I think, although San Francisco has gotten to be a much wealthier city than when I was a kid, I think the nature of life on the streets there is worse. But I do think that because of their money, Feinstein and Pelosi are insulated from the nasty things that take place on the streets of San Francisco.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation. Perhaps you have a comment or a question about this subject of immigration. One of the things that I've appreciated about Terence Jeffery is he really has pulled together a lot of facts and figures that many people have not seen. And I might just give you a program note that next hour we're also going to be talking with David Rubin. He is the former mayor of Shiloh in Israel. And if nothing else, one of the things he likes to talk about, and we'll talk about many things, is that they built a wall, and the wall really works. You hear a lot of people say, well, does a wall really work? Well, let's hear from an individual in Israel that talks about what dramatic changes took place when they built a wall there in Israel. So that'll be the next hour, which sort of relates to some of the conversation we're having here. But if you'd like to join us, we'd love to hear from you. Maybe you have some comments about immigration, or maybe some facts and figures you'd like to track down. We have Terence Jeffery with us a little bit longer. He's the editor-in-chief of CNS News. You can go to cnsnews.com and find all sorts of great material, not just by him, but by many of the other writers, and it is available on our website, pointofview.net. So let's take a break, 1-800-351-1212. Let me also point you to the commentary that I did back, and it aired on May 6th, about crime on the border, that gives you a few of those facts and figures as well, in case you'd like to pass it on or post it on your Facebook page or Twitter feed. It's all available to you at our website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation with Terence Jeffery for just a few more minutes, editor-in-chief of CNS News, and you can go to cnsnews.com and find out a little bit more. I think maybe we have a better phone line now. Terence, if nothing else, let's also talk about government for just a minute, because I've also seen that you've put together some interesting statistics. One of those, want to make money, work for the government. Now, you and I both have something in common. I was born in Berkeley. You're born in San Francisco. You live in the Washington, D.C. area. I used to live in the Washington, D.C. area when I went to Georgetown. And one of the things I found is the wealthiest areas in the country all seem to surround Washington, D.C. Tell us more.
Well, it's an interesting fact. If you look at the census, every year they come out with the median household income in every county in the United States, and we'll sort them and rank them by the highest. And last year, if I remember correctly, the 5 wealthiest counties in the United States of America by median household income were all suburbs of Washington, D.C. They included the little independent city of Falls Church, which the Census Bureau counts as a county, but it was the wealthiest, followed by Loudoun County, Virginia, Fairfax County, Virginia, Arlington County, Virginia, and Montgomery County, Maryland. Those are the wealthiest counties in the United States of America. Why? Because they surround the federal capital city where everybody's making money.
So again, one of the things I love about the fact that you gather these statistics together is for those of us that do commentaries or talk radio, you can kind of deal with some of those. And again, if you have not been able to go to the website, I would encourage you to do so, because we have a link to his 5 federal courts on Mexican border lead nation in criminal convictions. And, of course, my commentary came out May 6th on crime on the border. But there's another one that you've written about, and that is federal spending set a record. And this is something I talked about earlier with a member of Congress, that when you look at the impact that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act has made, we now, even from the Pew Charitable Trust, recognize there are 41 states, and we broadcast in 42 states here. So most of the states that are listening right now are in states that have record revenue. Even the governor of California was able to revise the budget for the Golden State to include a $21 billion surplus. Illinois, where we broadcast, actually have said that individual and corporate tax revenues have exceeded internal forecasts by more than $1 billion, even though some of those governors in those blue states complain about the tax cut. They're benefiting from this increased revenue. But, Terry Jeffries, then when you go and start looking at what happens, do they return that dividend back to the... No, we just spend more money. Talk about that.
No, it is a quite remarkable thing that this year, as of last month, the federal government is spending more money, adjusted for inflation, it's real spending, than it ever has in the history of the country. And that has not been the case in recent years, because in 2000... we had the recession that hit in December 2007, ran through all of 2008 into early 2009. And, Bush went after that with the bailout of the banks, the TARP bill, and right before Obama came in. When Obama came in, he had his massive $800 billion stimulus. So in fiscal 2009, federal spending was huge because the government had the excuse of trying to stop the recession and stop the bank disaster. So it's been hard for federal spending, when adjusted for inflation, to get back up there. But it is this year. We are spending record money. We have like a $580 billion deficit so far this year, despite the fact that they're bringing in a lot of tax money, too, because the economy is growing. And it really is a horrible thing, and it just says that it doesn't matter whether Republicans or Democrats are in power in Washington, D.C., the government just keeps growing and keeps spending money.
Well, and again, I'm glad you said that, because I try to play it down the middle and get criticism on both sides. But again, the bottom line is that you can look at the graph, and again, at cnsnews.com, you can see that federal spending, and you can see it dipped once or twice, mostly because of the recession. But other than that, spending goes up. Doesn't matter whether you have a Republican president or a Democratic president, whether you have a Republican-controlled Congress or Democratic-controlled Congress. And one other thing, since you live in around the Beltway, maybe just barely outside the Beltway, but those inside the Beltway have a different definition of cut. And that is, you're already laughing. Let me finish my sentence. And that is that if a budget's supposed to grow by a certain percentage and you even reduce it by 1 percentage point, you're still getting more next year than you're getting this year, but that's, according to Washington, D.C. analysts, a cut. Only in Washington, D.C., where you get more money the next year than you did last year, is that considered a cut. And so this is something to remember during this election year when people are talking about, I can't believe all the Trump cuts. I wish they were true, because if anything, spending is at all-time records, isn't it?
It is. It's an absolute record. And you're right, the politicians just assume growth. In fact, Kirby, I live inside the Beltway. I actually live in Falls Church, Virginia, which which is theoretically the wealthiest place in the country. I wish I was one of the wealthiest people in the country. I'm not. But, you say you grew up in Berkeley, one of the most beautiful places anywhere in this country. Fantastic place. San Francisco, the whole Bay Area, it's a beautiful place. Everybody knows that the San Francisco Bay Area is a wealthy place. And they know that because of the technical revolution in the last 30 years, Silicon Valley being in the South Bay, there's the great weather and scenery. There's obvious reasons for, in a free economy, the San Francisco Bay Area to be one of the wealthiest places in the world. But what an outrage it is, and how telling it is, that the suburbs of Washington, D.C., the place where they suck in all the tax money, not just from the San Francisco Bay Area, but from every community in this country, that the Washington area is wealthier than the San Francisco area. So the high-tech industry gets beat by the government industry. That tells you what you need to know about modern America.
I think so. Again, if you'd like to know more about some of the things we've been talking about today, we have some of those links on our website, pointofview.net, or you can go to cnsnews.com. And Terry Jeffery, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you very much.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll see if we can get a good line with our individual that has been the former mayor of Shiloh, David Rubin. Many of you, of course, have questions about Israel and what is taking place there, so I thought we'd get some of his perspective as well. But also, we've posted an article. It's entitled, "It Works. Israeli Mayor Says Border Wall with Egypt Eliminated Illegal Immigration in 2 years," and, of course, also eliminated some of the kinds of problems we have on the border. So I thought that would be of interest to you. And then we'll get into where we are in the nation of Israel right now, what is happening there. And, of course, as you well know, we have a trip that we're going to be taking to Israel in the fall. And so if you are still interested, we still have information about that on our website. Just go to the right-hand side there. Little button that says Go to Kerby with Israel. We filled one bus, trying to fill the second, and probably will shortly. So if you would like to join us, we do need to hear from you. And some of you might be saying, you haven't said anything this week about China. Well, that's because we're saving all of it for tomorrow. We're going to look at a number of different aspects of China. We're going to look at the economic issues. We're going to look at the tariff, what this might mean. Is this going to affect the stock market? What does it mean in terms of your investments? So we'll have Jerry Tuma in here. Also want to look at some of the military issues associated with China, some of the issues of hacking and espionage that have been perpetrated by China. So tomorrow will be our discussion about China. And if you are interested in any of that, I hope that not only will you tune in, but I hope you'll call in as well. Let me mention that my commentary today, interestingly enough, is on the subject of voter suppression. There are still a number of candidates that are saying, if we hadn't had voter suppression, this governor or that gubernatorial candidate would have been elected. I kind of take that on. But also, one of the other things that people have been writing about is if we keep talking about voter suppression, a lot of people are going to say, what's the use of vote? And some people might not just vote in the next election. So that'd be kind of intriguing as well. Well, we have a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after these important messages.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour I want to spend some time, first of all, talking about the role of God and the role of religion in our society. And a good way to kind of introduce that is to go back to a very excellent address, commencement address given by the Vice President, Mike Pence. It was given at Liberty University on Saturday. Now, if it had been on the program on Monday, I would have talked about it then, but that is when Penna Dexter covered the program, and then even yesterday we had Nick Pitts. So even though this is Wednesday, I do want to talk about his very, very, very powerful speech on Saturday. He's also speaking at Taylor University, which, by the way, has become real controversial, but we'll leave that for another day. But, of course, as you well know, the vice president and his wife are very committed believers, and we've even talked about the fact that his wife, Karen, was criticized for wanting to teach art at the Emmanuel Christian School. So this, in some respects, is a good setup to his speech, because although they're committed believers, he basically was challenging them to stand firm, because he believes there are going to be more and more attacks against Christians, because he's seen what has happened to him and his wife. And it boils down to what Gary Bauer says in one of his commentaries here: the days of easy Christianity in America are over. You've had people of faith that have shaped this country since its founding, but sometime in the last century, things began to change, and certainly even in the last administration or so, there have been a desire to have government force Christians to do things, and it hasn't just been at the federal level. We've seen it at the state level as well, and if this is maybe new information to you, you might be a new listener to Point of View. Just stick around on a typical Friday when we have Kelly Shackelford from Liberty Institute, now called First Liberty, or Jeremy Dice, who I'm going to quote from in just a minute, or Chelsea Ullman, or somebody of that nature. They will remind you only so quickly about some of the attacks on religious liberty. Now, one of the things that Gary Bauer points out is the current administration, that would be President Donald Trump and Vice President Mike Pence, have reversed a few of those policies, but it almost doesn't make any difference, because the point he's making, that at least Gary Bauer is making, is there is a sense in which the culture is really now coming against Christian ideas. So that's why in his speech on Saturday, Vice President Mike Pence warned the young Christian graduates at Liberty University that their faith may cost them their job if they take their Christianity seriously on issues ranging from, say, the sanctity of human life to the whole definition of marriage. So he told them to be prepared to be mocked for nothing else, because he and his wife have faced that as well. But here's a couple of quotes real quickly, and then I want to move on to, I mentioned Jeremy Dice. That's one of the articles we've posted here, his piece about the congressional oaths. The vice president said, quote, "Some of the loudest voices for tolerance today have little tolerance for traditional Christian values. So as you go about your daily life, just be ready, because you're going to be asked not just to tolerate things that violate your faith, you're going to be asked to endorse them. You're going to be asked to bow down to the idols of popular culture." So that was one of his comments. And then near the end, he said this, quote, "So, class of 2019, my word to all of you is to decide here and now that you're going to stand firm, that you'll persevere, that you'll always be prepared to give a reason for the hope that you have, and to do it with gentleness and respect." Of course, that's a quote from Scripture. He says, "Because our nation and our world need that message of grace and love maybe now more than ever before. So again, calling for the graduates of Liberty University to stand firm, and so we'll certainly talk about some of that in the future. But I thought it would also be a perfect setup to one of the pieces we've posted, and that is, if you've not been aware, let me give you the context, and then we'll read Jeremy Dice's commentary briefly on it. And that is the decision by the Democrat leadership in the House of Representatives to no longer call for individuals to swear, "So help me God." Now, that's always been a phrase that's been used when you swear in. And yet, interestingly enough, we had the Democrat representative, Steve Cohen, who is the chairman of this particular committee. He's from Tennessee, by the way. He asked the witnesses to testify, quote, "Do you swear or affirm under penalty or perjury the testimony that you're about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief?" At that point, you had kind of a hand go up, and that is Representative Michael Johnson. He's kind of a constitutional scholar of sorts and certainly interested in the history of how things are done in America. He's a representative from Louisiana. He said, I have a parliamentary inquiry. He said, "I think we left out the phrase, 'So help me God.'" Well, then Democratic Representative Steve Cohen said, "We did." Johnson asked if the witness could swear in again, but this time with the traditional phrase, "So help me God." At that point, Chairman Cohen shakes his head and says no, and then asks if they want to do it, but some of them don't want to do it. Well, that didn't satisfy Representative Michael Johnson. He said, "Well, it goes back to our founding history. It's been part of our tradition for more than 2 centuries, and I don't know that we should abandon it now." And Cohen then looks at Johnson with a face that kind of looks like, "What planet are you from?" And Johnson then adds, "Could I ask the witness if he would choose to use the phrase?" Then at that point, Representative Gerald Nadler, who's a Democrat from New York, of course, we've talked about him quite a bit, he just simply shut down the discussion by saying, "We do not have religious tests for office or anything else. We should let it go at that." Okay, well, that gets us to the piece that we've posted here by Jeremy Dice. I talked about this the other day, and Jeremy, in his piece, said, one need not reach deep into the far reaches of political history to recall the controversy that erupted during the 2012 Democratic National Convention. Their delegates first voted to remove God from their platform and then responded to voter outrage, quickly reversing themselves. Perhaps another vote is necessary, but this time not without a platform. Instead, the venue is Congress itself. And then he goes and talks about this interchange about whether or not the phrase, "So help me God," should be removed from the swearing in of various people that will testify before the House of Representatives. And Steve Cohen, the representative, said, "I think God belongs in religious institutions, in temple, in church, in cathedral, in mosque, but not in Congress." And of course, then, as I mentioned, Gerald Nadler said, "We do not have religious tests." That's where Jeremy Dice said, "That's rich." As I wrote earlier this year in the Daily Wire, Mr. Nadler's own party has a problematic history of asserting religious tests for office, albeit one that was until recently limited to the other side of Capitol Hill, that would be the Senate, and has nothing to do with the oath of office or oaths of congressional witnesses in any event. Indeed, he says, according to historical tradition, it was none other than George Washington himself who appended the phrase, "So help me God," to the end of the initial oath of office on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City. Well, something that was started by George Washington apparently is coming to an end in the House of Representatives, at least as long as Democrats are in control of it. And if you've got some thoughts about that, I'd love to hear them. 1-800-351-1212. When we come back, we'll get into some other issues, but I thought I just might mention this. And if you'd like to read the entire commentary by Jeremy Dice, it's on our website today, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Since a number of presidential candidates are warning about voter suppression, it seems like a good time to accurately define the term. Let's start with a simple issue. Cutting back early voting days is not voter suppression. Early voting in North Carolina reduced the days for early voting from 17 to 10. Florida reduced their early voting days from 14 to 8. Citizens who are properly registered can still vote, but the number of days you can vote early are less. If this were an example of voter suppression, then any of the states that don't provide early voting would be guilty of voter suppression. Hope you can see the fallacy of calling this voter suppression. Now let's look at the more common complaint that voter ID laws and other voter requirements constitute voter suppression. I've documented in previous commentaries that after most of these states instituted voter laws, minority voting increased. For example, Georgia law required voters to be removed from the polls if they had not cast a ballot in 3 years and did not respond to any inquiry by mail. Even though such voters were removed from the rolls, black voter registration increased, and in the last election, African American turnout also increased. All of these facts, along with other relevant statistics, haven't prevented candidates from making claims of voter suppression. In her keynote speech at the NAACP convention last week, Senator Kamala Harris proclaimed that without voter suppression, Stacey Abrams would be governor of Georgia, Andrew Gillum, governor of Florida. For the record, Abrams lost by 54,000 votes, Gillum lost by 32,000 votes. I hope you keep some of these facts in mind, since you'll be hearing more about voter suppression from a number of candidates. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
One of the other things I wanted to talk about is the fact that Alabama will be passing, it looks like now, the most significant, or some people call the strictest pro-life bill in the country. And so it's worth talking about that for just a minute, if for no other reason than that's led to a sex strike and a number of other things which we're not even going to bother to talk about. But yesterday, the Alabama State Senate passed HB 314 by a vote of 25-6 with one abstention. The bill establishes the legal personhood of unborn children and prohibits nearly all abortions. If indeed the Republican Governor Kay Ivey signs the legislation, which the bill's supporters anticipate, it would be the strictest pro-life law in the entire country. And so you already have the pro-life bill that has been passed in Georgia, and you've had, of course, what I've already mentioned, this so-called sex strike. Can you imagine what's going to happen in Alabama? Of course, the difference is there aren't many movies shot in Alabama. There are quite a number of movies that are shot in Georgia, but nevertheless, we'll leave that for a moment as well. But this would be the strictest pro-life law in the country. And if nothing else, because it was being considered, that's where you had that famous, or I should say, I guess, infamous statement by the Democratic State Representative John Rogers, who a while back when we talked about this said, well, you know, some kids are unwanted, so you kill them now or you kill them later. You bring them in the world unwanted, unloved, and then you send them to the electric chair. So that was kind of the idea that, why are you so worried about abortion? If we allow them to be born, they'll be unwanted, they'll end up being criminals, and we'll end up killing them. So why don't we just solve the problem now? And it's like, gosh, I mean, how crass could it be? Interestingly enough, to the credit even of the Democratic Senator Doug Jones, he, as well as many other people, of course, criticized him. So let's give credit where credit is due. But nothing else. That is, again, one of those issues that is going to be very contentious, because once you have Georgia passing the heartbeat bill, and other states, by the way, that have done so as well, but it's been kind of in the crosshairs at the moment, and now Alabama doing so, what will happen in the future? And so there's a really good piece that came out today by Alexandra DeSantis, who says that Alabama's effort to pass House Bill 314 takes place against the backdrop of nationwide contention over abortion policy. So far this year, Democratic legislatures in New York, Illinois, Virginia, Rhode Island, Vermont, Nevada, and New Mexico are considering or have already passed bills to legalize abortion or loosen abortion restrictions during the last 3 months of pregnancy. So you have two things happening almost simultaneously. I think it's because both red states and blue states, both pro-life states and pro-choice states, are recognizing that the days of Roe versus Wade may be coming to an end. And so as a result, you have this really interesting schism in which you have in the state of New York, I'll just use that as one example, individuals applauding a bill that essentially would allow abortion right up to the moment of birth. And yet that's not controversial. But then Georgia passes a bill that would say once you can detect a heartbeat, you can't have abortions after that. And that is controversial, and there are all sorts of actors and actresses and directors and all sorts of people saying we're never going to do another film in Georgia. And, of course, then you have other states, these would be the red states primarily, Ohio, Mississippi, Kentucky, and Georgia, that have passed heartbeat bills. And, of course, the Alabama bill would be even more significant than that, which would prohibit abortion after fetal heartbeat can be detected, usually after about 6 weeks gestation. And, of course, this most recent one in Georgia, love to hear from you, Georgia listeners, was signed, of course, by the Georgia Governor, Brian Kemp. And so there is, of course, the media backlash to all of that. Now, you might, in the midst of this, say, well, what does it matter because abortion is still legal? True. But the argument that has been made by a number of people, including David French, in a piece that came out a while back, and Penna Dexter and I spent some time talking about that in a weekend edition, is that by passing these bills, it sends a signal to the justices. Because just think about that. If the only bills that were being passed right now were like a 24-hour waiting period, informed consent, something of that nature, then, or maybe some of the bills require that an abortionist have admitting procedures in a local hospital, the justices might say, well, why do we want to overturn Roe versus Wade when the only thing you're asking for is that an abortionist have admitting procedures in a local hospital? And so in some respects, even though these pieces of legislation will be struck down, first of all, I think it's a good illustration of sending a signal that many people are ready to end this unbelievably liberal stance on abortion. When you talk about the fact that abortions are allowed in the second and even third trimester in the United States, you only can find a few countries in the world where abortions are allowed at that late stage, and those are countries like China, North Korea, not exactly the group we want to be associated with. So that is certainly the case. And so that's part of it. And again, Alexandra DeSantis says both heartbeat bills and stricter abortion restrictions, such what we have in Alabama's, have a little chance of being upheld in courts. I've just mentioned that, given the current framework of abortion rights jurisprudence initiated in Roe versus Wade, as well as Planned Parenthood versus Casey. But the scathing media coverage of these pro-life laws receive, compared to laws that allow abortion for any reason, even after fetuses are developed enough to survive outside the womb, she says, is telling. By the way, that Planned Parenthood versus Casey, I don't want to get too much into the weeds. I'll leave this to our lawyers. But there was a case involving taxation, which 5 of the conservative justices on the Supreme Court decided to overturn a precedent that has been around for decades. And the reaction from the 4 liberals, in particular Stephen Breyer, was, wait a minute, if you're going to overturn this precedent, that means you might later overturn the precedent of Roe versus Wade, which I thought, just look about when you're talking about an issue having to do with taxation, where do the minds go? Well, immediately to Roe versus Wade. So it is interesting that even a case having nothing to do with abortion, having nothing to do with bioethics, nevertheless resulted in a counterpoint back and forth on the issue of abortion, because I think a lot of people believe that maybe the days of Roe versus Wade are numbered. We'll see. If it is, even though people are predicting the end of the world as we know it, what it simply will do is revert back to the states, which is exactly why you have this remarkable dichotomy between some of these states that have Democratic legislatures like New York, Illinois, Virginia, Rhode Island, Vermont, Nevada, New Mexico, which in many cases have actually legalized abortion or loosened it when abortion is already sort of legalized anyway. Then you also have other states like Ohio, Mississippi, Kentucky, Georgia, Alabama that have heartbeat bills. Texas would have had one, but I think they missed the deadline, so that's the end on that, and just an interesting statement there as well. One more point, and when we come back, I want to talk a little bit about the investigation of the investigators, because the decision has been made by the Attorney General, William Barr, to actually have U.S. Attorney John Durham investigate the origins of the Trump-Russia collusion. So we'll get into that in just a minute. But let me just mention one of the other issues by Alexandra de Sanctis, which I thought was interesting, is that the current, I think she's now number 2, the leader in the Democratic Party right now, of course, is Joe Biden. Number 2 used to be Bernie Sanders, but now it looks like number 2 is Elizabeth Warren. So interesting. It's only by a percentage point, but nevertheless, Elizabeth Warren is in there. And so the question was whether or not she would actually go to a town hall event sponsored by Fox News. Well, Elizabeth Warren, this is her Twitter post. I love town halls. I've done more than 70 since January, and I'm glad to have television audience to be part of them. But Fox News has invited me to do a town hall, but I'm turning them down. Here's why. And then in another post, she says, Fox News is a hate-for-profit racket that gives a megaphone to racists and conspiracists. It's designed to turn us against each other, risking life and death consequences to provide cover for the corruption that's rotting our government and hollowing out our middle class. Can you imagine Fox News, no matter what you think of it, to call it what? You know, this is just amazing. A hate-for-profit racket. You know, the same town hall that I think Bernie Sanders was on Fox News. He didn't have a problem with it. And certainly Donald Trump was willing to go on just about any talk show. But here, I'm not even going to go on a network because they're hate for profit. So you won't see Elizabeth Warren on Fox News or on a town hall. I think it's an opportunity for some of the other also-rans to get some visibility on Fox News. Because after all, it's still one of the most watched cable networks in the country. We'll be right back.
So you sit down and you do your budget and you look at all your monthly costs, your bills, your income, and it seems like there's never quite enough. You know what would help? What would really help? Finding $500 a month to help balance things out. And that is the typical savings, $500 a month for a family when you switch to MediShare for your health care. MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry, and it works. No wonder more than 400,000 people are doing this now. And look, whether you're single or married or you have kids, this can make sitting down to do a monthly budget a lot more fun. Just think what you could do with $500 a month. It can cover a car payment or pay back loans or whatever. Join MediShare and go out to dinner to celebrate. Find out more. The MediShare people are so easy to talk to. They can answer any questions. They are super friendly. Call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
Tired of fake news? Support truth. Join Point of View's Truth Team and bring healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, or 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We're talking about the heartbeat bill, which, again, you had a number of these so-called heartbeat bills passed in Georgia, Ohio, Mississippi, Kentucky, and then just talking about this particular piece of legislation that may indeed be signed by the governor in Alabama, which would be even more significant. And if you'd like to join us, love to hear your comments. 1-800-351-1212. Let's head out to Georgia first and talk to Kathy. Thank you for joining us today here on Point of View. Oh, Kathy, you on? Well, I don't know. We'll see if we can get that particular call in there maybe I need to push the button and we'll find out. Somebody let me know if we got Kathy, do we have you now? No, I guess not. Well, we're having problems with our computer, so that we'll see if we can solve that in just a minute. But let me just mention that was one of the issues that we will talk about here on Point of View. And certainly, if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Just before we went to the break, though, I just thought I would finish my point, and that is Elizabeth Warren has said, I'm not going to be on Fox News for any kind of town hall because it's a hate-for-profit racket. And I might just mention that Bernie Sanders has been on. Amy Klobuchar is going to be on, I believe. Beto O'Rourke said he was going to be on. Of course, the mayor, Pete Buttigieg, is going to be on. Kristen Gillibrand. So, again, I think by saying that it's a hate-for-profit organization, I'm not going to be on it, first of all, eliminates the possibility that people that might watch Fox News could actually hear your comments. And second of all, I think it gives some of the other individuals that are much further down in the polling to have a national opportunity. And do you have to agree with everything that is said on a network before you appear on it? Well, of course not. And that's just kind of crazy. Let's try again to see if we can get Kathy in Georgia. Kathy, you with us?
Yes, sir. Can you hear me?
I can. And I guess we had a glitch on our end, but we've figured it out. So I think you want to talk about the heartbeat bill, so you have the floor.
I would love to talk about the heartbeat bill. We are just thrilled to death here in Georgia that they've gone the full extent of passing the heartbeat bill. As an extra side note, I work at the Living Vine in Georgia. We're a Christian maternity home, and we've been praying for this for so long because we see firsthand what happens to some of these girls that go through abortion, and some of the girls that come to us have had abortions and they're on their second child or their third child, and the truth that the other side doesn't like to talk about is the fact that when they push these girls into these abortions and how it scars them emotionally, and there's nobody there afterwards to sit down with them and actually counsel them on it or to tell them how, down the road how it's going to affect their life. So we are just so happy that finally we got somebody interested in the bill and to get it signed and that they moved forward with it.
Well, as I've said before, I recognize that these bills out of Ohio and Mississippi and Kentucky and, of course, Georgia and maybe soon in Alabama are going to be overturned. And by the way, we have listeners in every one of those states. But I think it sends a signal to members of Congress, sends signals certainly to justices that we want more than just, nibbling at the edges on this issue of Roe versus Wade. And this gives you a conversation to have. And, of course, I'm sorry for the incredible backlash that your state is facing right now. I think it's going to be a lot of sound and fury, but when it's all through, maybe there won't be quite as much on that. But nevertheless, be kind of interesting to see how it plays out. So, Kathy, if nothing else, I certainly applaud you for working in a pro-life venture, and we just need to have more of you involved in this. And, of course, as I've said before, we're already winning the war of ideas. There are many more crisis pregnancy centers, pregnancy resource centers in the country, maternity homes, than there are Planned Parenthood or abortion clinics. So that's good news, and we stand ready to provide for those women when they are convinced that the only solution to their crisis is an abortion, to say there are some alternatives. So, Kathy, thank you for the good work that I know you're doing.
All right. Thank you, Kerby. Take
If
care.
you would like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to Scott in Missouri, listening on the internet. What would you like to add to our conversation today, Scott?
Hey, thanks, Kerby. My comment really is regarding abortion, but particularly the comment from Stephen Breyer about precedent, about changing precedent. I think if that's all they have left in the argument of abortion, that's a pretty weak argument because, reflecting that, we should basically still have traditional marriage, and I hate to say this, but we would still have slavery.
And segregated schools. That was the example Clarence Thomas did as his rebuttal to Breyer. He said, well, we hadn't changed precedent. We still have segregated schools, separate but equal, So, yes, I mean, obviously some precedents need to go. Dred Scott is a good example, as well as just a variety of other ones. So, this idea that once you have a precedent that is brought in by a liberal, it can't change. But if we have precedents by conservatives, we can change those any day. So that, like you said, if that's your best argument, it's not a very good one. But I think you wanted to make another point, so go for it.
Yeah, a second point on that really kind of goes toward the Democrat Party in general is there seems to be their only arguments anymore is we want to be the first person to have this type of person elected. We want to be the first person to have that type of person elected. I mean, now we're dealing with, and don't get me wrong, I don't have any problem with various, females or males or whatever being elected at the higher office. But that seems to be their only focus anymore. And along with Breyer's argument of precedent, if that's all you have left to argue for leadership, you really have run out of ideas.
That's yeah. And the argument I've made before, and I think you would agree with that, is I don't see a lot of ideas on the Democrat side other than such radical ones as to be unworkable. I mean, anybody that seriously thinks that Medicare for all is going to work hasn't run the numbers, as we just talked about earlier on the program. Anybody that thinks that the Green New Deal is not going to just devastate every free market economy hasn't run the numbers. And so then the argument the other side is worse, or this Republican Party are going to shove grandma off the cliff, as we've seen before, or Donald Trump is a bully, which he is sometimes. If that's the best you've got, that's not going to be a very interesting 2020 campaign. So we'll see where this unfolds. But again, if your best argument is precedent on the Supreme Court, that's a very bad argument because some of the most significant precedents in the history of the Supreme Court have been overturned because they were bad precedents in the first place.
Yeah. And if you don't mind me making a final comment about Trump, my feeling about the reason why I think the liberal Democrat are so scared of Trump is not because of who he is, but because of what he did. The fact that Trump could be elected as a Republican, I think, scares the Democrats to death because then they realize, if he can be a Republican, anybody could be a Republican, and that's a frightening thing for their base, their voting base, that a guy like that could switch parties and get elected at a national office. I think that's why they're so scared of him. I don't think it has anything to do with any of these other outlier issues, because they realize, wow, if he can generate that kind of enthusiasm for elections, then we're in trouble because all we have left is, like I said, precedent and what do you call it?
Fear-mongering and identity politics and some of that, yeah.
Identity politics, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, very good.
That's
Scott,
what
good
I
point.
think they're afraid of.
Yeah. Let me take another phone call here just to make sure we get all these in before we run out of time. Let's head to the state of Missouri. John, I think you'd like to add some comments to our discussion today.
Yes, sir. I'm actually calling from Georgia.
Oh, okay.
Yes, sir. Sorry about that. I think, as I was discussing with my wife, I think this is an incredible opportunity for all of us Christians. If we talk a good game and say, I wish this, I wish we could do that, or I wish we could do more to help. I think this is wonderful. I think we should all actually seek out a way to help, either by fostering, adopting,
yes,
volunteering at a shelter or whatever at a children's home, whatever need arises. And I think, it's time to organize. It's time to get a statewide effort going, even if people can only give two hours a week, but I think we should definitely mobilize and, try to raise the next generation of Christians, try to take it back. We're losing so many people to addiction, to just wayward means. People are just nihilistic anymore. Nobody really wants to do much of anything, and this could be something to re-energize the Christian faith.
Very good. I need to take a break, but John, again, one of the I think calls is, consider somehow you're going to involve your time, your talent, or your treasure. And certainly the pro-life movement is a great place to invest any or all of that. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and we weren't able to connect up with David Rubin, but let me just mention we do have an article by him, former mayor of Shiloh, Israel, about building a border between Israel and Egypt, and it said they were able to prohibit and prevent illegal immigration. The number of rapes and murders in southern Tel Aviv skyrocketed between 2010 and 2012. When about 55,000 illegal immigrants entered into Israel. And, of course, by 2016, the Israeli government built a steel wall between the border of Israel and Egypt. Only 11 illegal immigrants entered the country. That's a cut off from 55,000 to 11. I thought that was kind of interesting. And then talks about some of the issues of what they had to address and how sometimes people would call it racist or that they were going crazy. But you know what? It worked. And so while we're talking about Israel, I thought I'd also mention that there have been a lot of anti-Israel things being said in Congress, as you well know. As a matter of fact, let me just hold up, if you haven't seen it, our anti-Semitism booklet is a good illustration of some of the things that have been said. But since then, we've had so many others. You've had more recently Rashida Tlaib from Michigan, who, interestingly enough, said that the tragedy of the Holocaust had a calming feeling on her. Really? But more to the point, she made the argument that the Palestinians welcomed the Jews and that that's actually what happened, and that's why we have Israel. And interestingly enough, because of that, the Palestinians got removed. So they welcomed the Israelis and the Jews, and then they got kicked out. Well, that's not exactly the history. As a matter of fact, it's just the opposite. You had the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who was actually an ally of Adolf Hitler. He told Hitler that the Arabs and Germany shared the same enemies, namely the English, the Jews, and the communists. There were all sorts of uprisings with Arab Muslims, in which, in many cases back then, there were hundreds of Jews that were killed. And, of course, just the rank anti-Semitism pretty much, if nothing else, says that what she was talking about is a fake history. And if that's not enough, just the other day before Congress, there was an individual by the name of Omar Shulman, who is Muslim, who opened the prayer in Congress. He was invited there by Eddie Bernice Johnson and by Nancy Pelosi. And I saw on a local network, WFAA Channel 8 here, complaining about that he was mistreated because people were upset that he was speaking. Well, it wasn't because he was Muslim. It's because if you have followed what he has said, he has denounced Israel as an apartheid state. He's even compared Israel to Nazi Germany. If nothing else, if they had even taken the time to vet him, they would have discovered that he has defended Hamas, which is a terrorist organization. He is called Zionists enemies of God. They would also have discovered that he has called for violence against Israel and even prayed for the destruction of Israel in the 2014 Gaza war. So I think there's enough to be concerned about. One of the representatives, interestingly enough, from New York, said it's a bad call to have this person. It's horrible judgment. And after the 2019 that we've had so far, where members of the Democratic caucus are pushing anti-Semitism and anti-Israeli hate, it was bad judgment. So just again, a little bit of the story that unfortunately our local Channel 8 people did not cover very well. But just before we run out of time, I want to do two things. First of all, mention briefly that this investigation of the investigators is going forward. I wanted to mention it now. As we know more, we'll talk about it in the future here on Point of View. But the Attorney General, William Barr, has actually appointed a Connecticut attorney by the name of John Durham. And now, if you're not familiar with him, there's some really good pieces that have come out in the last couple of days. I'm really impressed with him. And by the way, both Republicans and Democrats have been impressed with him in the past. He has handled very sensitive investigations, sometimes of the FBI, sometimes of the Justice Department and others, under both Democratic administrations and Republican administrations. And he's already been investigating some of the media leaks from the deep state. But again, if you want to get a sense of how significant he may be to this investigation, let me just quote from John Yoo. Y-O-O. He's been a law professor, but also was a lawyer in the Justice Department. He was on with Laura Ingraham the other night on Fox News, and this is what he had to say. He said, you wouldn't go with a U.S. attorney like John Durham, someone of his stature, unless the Attorney General, that would be William Barr, thinks that actually something criminal might have happened, that someone might have violated the law, that there might have been malfeasance, that people at the FBI or the Justice Department were acting out of partisan motives, not just out of incompetence or stupidity. So I got a feeling that if there's anybody that has the potential of digging in, it would certainly be John Durham. So that's a name you're hearing today, and we'll follow that as we know more. But just before we run out of time, let me just give you a program note, because a lot of you said, okay, you're going to cover China? It's Wednesday. You guys haven't said a thing about China. Well, I wasn't on the show the last 2 days, and maybe they covered it, but I'm going to make sure we cover it in a lot of detail tomorrow. At 1 o'clock Central Time, or of course 2 o'clock Eastern Time, or 11 o'clock Pacific Time, we are going to have Jerry Tuma in studio. We're going to talk about the economic issues, the tariffs. What does that do for consumers? How is that affecting the stock market? What should you even think about if this tariff war, this trade war goes on for any length of time? We'll talk about the economic issues. But then I also want to go and talk about the military issues as well, because China has been building islands, if you can believe that, and fortifying islands and developing advanced warfare weapons that could threaten the United States Navy. As a matter of fact, the U.S. Navy has been under a cyber siege by Chinese hackers. One report even said that China has derived an incalculable near and long-term military advantage from hacking, which has altered the balance of global power. And let's just talk about the cyber attacks against the United States in general. You might remember under the previous administration, under President Barack Obama, China stole the records of more than 20 million government employees. That just can't be good. China has also been stealing technology, intellectual property, and jobs as well. And finally, let me just mention this issue of propaganda. It turns out that a lot of campuses in this country have what are called Confucius Institutes. Those are actually funded by the Chinese Communist Party. And it turns out that the federal government is so concerned about spying that is being done by these institutes that the Pentagon, that is the Defense Department, is cutting funding to universities that host these institutes. And you also have the current FBI director, Christopher Wray, recently said that Chinese espionage and counterintelligence is so deep, more diverse, more vexing, more challenging, more comprehensive, more concerning than any other counterintelligence threat that I can think of. That comes from the FBI director. So we're going to get into the real threat that China is and will be to us in the future. We'll look at the economic issues. We'll look at the political issues. We'll look at the military issues. We'll look at counter-espionage. We'll look at hacking. We'll even look at the fact that it's, of course, the gross violator of human rights. And so China is our topic tomorrow. So if you've been wanting to learn about China, that's what we're going to do for the entire time here on Point of View. That's all we have. If you find yourself saying, I'd like to learn a little bit more about some of the things you've been mentioning, it's all at our website, pointofview.net, including my commentary today on voter suppression, also my link so that you can join with us to a trip to Israel, as well as information about some of the conversation we've had with some of our guests. That's all we have for today. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow as we talk about China right here on Point of View.
So you sit down and you do your budget and you look at all your monthly costs, your bills, your income, and it seems like there's never quite enough. You know what would help? What would really help? Finding $500 a month to help balance things out. And that is the typical savings, $500 a month for a family when you switch to MediShare for your health care. MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry, and it works. No wonder more than 400,000 people are doing this now. And look, whether you're single or married or you have kids, this can make sitting down to do a monthly budget a lot more fun. Just think what you could do with $500 a month. That can cover a car payment or pay back loans or whatever. Join MediShare and go out to dinner to celebrate. Find out more. The MediShare people are so easy to talk to. They can answer any questions. They are super friendly. Call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
Tired of fake news? Support truth. Join Point of View's Truth Team and bring healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, or 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.